Only the biggest stories, only the biggest guests, and only the biggest opinions. This is AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy, continuing our series, talking to Chicago's mayoral candidates. A lot of Chicago mayoral candidates, Dem City, okay, but they're making a play for center-right voters, like many of our listeners, because when it's a race to 15% in a crowded field, the 15% of, frankly, Republican voters in Chicago matter. And it was interesting. We had good conversations yesterday with Garry Chico, with Paul Vallis, and sort of the candidate that's really captured my imagination.
Oh, right.
Chicago party aunt.
Are you going to be, somebody asked me if that was Bruce Wolf, who is Chicago party aunt, the voice of.
The voice sounded similar, but the difference was Chicago party aunt's funny. That's the subtle difference.
And a little more sane.
We're continuing our conversation with those who want to have one with Garry McCarthy, who's been on the show before, of course, former Chicago police chief and a candidate for mayor of Chicago, February 26th. Garry, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it. Do we have Garry? Hello.
Garry?
Garry, do we got you? Do we have Garry?
Maybe he was mad.
It's maybe Chicago's party aunt is interrupting our broadcast. He doesn't want us to compare. All right, well, we're going to have to get Garry back. I thought we had him on the line. But anyway, the conversation I want to have with McCarthy, at least at the outset, I know you want to talk to him about Burke, but we started not talking as much because of the high-profile indictment of Ed Burke about crime in Chicago, which is public safety in Chicago, still a big issue. We had another decline in violent crime last year, so that's 3 years in a row. So that's the good news.
Homicide rate's down.
Right.
107.
So we had about round numbers here, not to be cavalier with individual lives,
I know,
but just
it sounds awful.
For statistical purposes, just to give you a sense of direction. About 800 murders 3 years ago, about 700 murders 2 years ago, about 600 murders last year. So that's progress, but it is still more murder, even with that progress, more murders last year in Chicago than New York and L.A. combined.
Really? With
obviously 5 times the combined population of Chicago. And so there's still something else going on here, not going on here in terms of public safety, different than other big cities like L.A. and New York. And so let's start our conversation with Garry McCarthy. There, Garry, are you with us?
I am with you.
Okay, great. Great. Thanks for joining us. Yeah, sorry about that.
Well, first of all, I'm glad you're back, Dan.
I actually know him, Mr. McCarthy. We're friends.
I heard a little bit about that. All right. We'll try to keep the
we won't be screaming at you.
The intensity to a minimum here. But
it wouldn't be the worst thing.
We were talking about I don't know if you heard it. So 3 years ago, round numbers, 800 murders. 2 years ago, 700 murders. Last year, 600 murders. Good news that it's on the decline. Bad news, still more homicides than New York and L.A. combined. So where are we with improving public safety in Chicago?
We're actually nowhere, Dan, and I'm glad you asked that question because over the last 3 years, in other words, 16, 17, and 18, compared to 13, 14, and 15, my last 3 years as superintendent, there's 658 more murders over the last 3 years. So, we don't want to compare ourselves to the increase that we suffered in 2016, which was about an 80% increase in the murder rate. And it's not that hard to bring down numbers that are just out of control like that. Mm. So, as you say, we're still in really poor shape compared to where we could be. 770 murders in 2016 compared to New York that had 290 last year in a city 3 times the size of Chicago. It's just unacceptable. Well, it doesn't have to be like this.
Well, and let me ask you that. So you worked with Eddie Johnson when you were Chicago police chief. There's been some candidates have weighed in on him in terms of whether they would keep him or not keep him.
Preckwinkle and Chico would get rid of him right away.
What's your assessment of Eddie Johnson, and to the extent that you would replace him, is what's happening on the streets of Chicago fundamentally an Eddie Johnson problem, or is it a civilian political leadership problem?
It's kind of both. I promoted Eddie twice. I really like Eddie. Eddie did a great job with the community. He has done a great job with the community based upon some of the problems that the department went through. But we've also abandoned the crime plan that we put in place that was recognized by the president and the Department of Justice as the best practices in policing. And everybody forgets about that. I want you to think about this, and if you can, go back and look at the 21st Century Task Force report that President Obama put together, where they collected the best practices across the country. And 90% of those, more than 90%, came straight out of the plan that we were doing here in Chicago. It's data-driven policing, where we know when, where, and who is committing crime. We get there first, and we prevent the next crime from happening. We abandoned that because of the politics of Chicago. And I want to point out that the first worst case of a video with policing that actually blew up was the quote-unquote chokehold death of Eric Garner in New York City.
Right.
New York City did not abandon the plan. They did not reverse course. They did not conduct the witch hunts within the department. They did not fire Bill Bratton. And as a result, New York City is still moving forward while we took a huge step backwards, resulting in mass murder here. The politics of this city emboldened criminals and hamstrung the police all at the same time. So there's a number of things that happen, but it doesn't have to be like this. We need somebody with the audacity to stop doing the things that we've been doing here in Chicago, the Chicago way. I mean, we certainly see that today.
Sure we do. His name's Bill Daley, the change agent.
Yeah. Yeah. I heard he's going to get rid of nepotism.
Yeah.
I mean,
that's his first line of order if he gets elected.
But you know what, Dan and Amy? Nobody seems to care that a whole bunch of politicians and bureaucrats. I actually said that the 90s called. They want their politicians and bureaucrats back. But a whole bunch of people jumped into this race when Ron dropped out.
I know.
Wimps. That's the old guard that's going to keep this place in the same place that it's in right now, which is going backwards.
All right. Well, speaking of the old guard, you've seem to be fairly quiet on the Ed Burke indictment and his relationship and fundraising efforts for Tony Preckwinkle, and Garry Chico was at his house and all this. Do you think that any of the candidates should step down because of their relationship with Ed Burke, and how do you feel about Ed Burke?
Well, I certainly hope that he's going to be okay. He's done incredible public service for the city for a very long time. If the allegations are true, they're very problematic. And I see this as part of the culture of illegitimacy that we suffer in city government here in Chicago. This is not about Ed Burke. There's been about 100 aldermen have served since 1972. And fully a third of them have been arrested, indicted, or gone to jail.
And the other 2/3 should have been.
They just didn't get caught, right? Yeah. But this is the Chicago way. This is the city where we don't want nobody sent. Call it what you will, and people tell me it's never going to change. And my answer is it's never going to change until somebody changes it. And I do think that people like Tony Preckwinkle, with Dana Mendoza right now. Oh, right. She's in Springfield getting sworn in for her job.
Yeah.
This stuff is unacceptable, yet we shrug our shoulders and we accept it as if it's never going to change. This is the way it's supposed to be.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt, but what structural changes on sort of the ethics front would you suggest? You've heard Daley talking about reducing the number of aldermen. Chico's talking about maybe reducing some of the feudalism in terms of how the city council operates. Outside employment should be prohibited. What's your approach to that?
Well, I think a number of those things may help. But one of the things I'm talking about, and I'm being serious, is we're talking about judicial oversight for the police department with a consent decree. Perhaps we should have the same thing with city government, considering that it's government that oversees the police department, streets and sands, the fire department, and all the other agencies that are subject to the same illegitimacy that we've been suffering through for decades here in the city. Maybe it's time to get the feds to come in and really investigate all these various components of city government. There's structural changes that need to be made, and I could talk about the ones in the police department that I recommended back in 2012 when I identified the dysfunction of the disciplinary system of the department. But as far as the rest of the city goes, I'm absolutely sure that all we have to do is turn over one rock, and we're going to have to turn over 50.
Yeah, well, we need some revenue here. So are you on board with casinos, legalizing marijuana?
Actually, I'm already, months ago, I talked about casinos, and as long as we close the back door on the crime, that's involved with the legalization of marijuana. There's two things about legalization that we have to make sure that we fix before we move forward. First of all, just like wise guys launder their money, the cartels are laundering their weed through the legalization process in places like Colorado and California. We do not want to support the cartels. So we have to make sure that we're keeping an eye on that. The second thing is we have to make sure that we have a place where we can deposit the money, because it's a cash business in places like Colorado, which nobody seems to care about the fact that shootings, murders, and robberies went through the roof because people are walking around with thousands and thousands of dollars.
Yeah, see if Paul Powell's shoebox is
available.
Yeah,
it's not as simple as people think. And, we got to make sure that we look behind the curtain a little bit. But I'm okay with both of those things. I actually was the first one talking about casinos in the airports, because you spend a lot of time sitting still at O'Hare when your plane gets canceled. So go spend some money and give us some.
But Gary, let's think this through a little bit more, or get a little bit more from you on this. Because, I mean, is that really the vision, the best vision for Chicago? Are we sort of in a sad place when we have to turn ourselves into sort of Vegas Midwest to try and keep the house of cards that is city government operating?
Yeah, agreed, Dave. But you know what? The fire alarms should be going off, and they're not. They should be going off in the state, and there's so many different levels that this should be happening. So we do have to do what we can to generate revenue. But, the other thing that I talk about is we got to get the city into the black. We've got to stop political spending, and we've got to do needs-based spending. And I could talk about things like the police academy that we don't need. I could talk about the Navy Pier flyover and investing another $10 million into the riverfront. We've got people who are suffering.
What about on the growth side? I mean, you've got to make this place a place that people want to come to. And as you said, it's a city problem. It's a state problem. People are fleeing Illinois and Chicago like it's on fire. And if you're not growing, you're dying. So how do you make this place more attractive? At the same time, if you're talking about syntaxes, regressive gambits like gambling and drugs, or real taxes on work or consumption, including increasing property taxes, how do you do that? How do you grow the city?
Well, it first starts by making the city safe. I'm looking at the news again this morning, and one of the things that I can't get over is we never fix things. We put Band-Aids on gunshot wounds and think that we're doing something special. We have to close Water Tower Place early because of mob actions. We've got carjackings on Lakeshore Drive. We've got shootings on Michigan Avenue. I mean, who would want to come here? I don't think Amazon came here because of the crime problem. We've got to first make the city safe. That's what we have to do before anything is going to change here. We've got to recognize that. Then we have to start developing the neighborhoods. It's not just about the downtown. We can hold on to downtown and have some economic stimulus in neighborhoods by, first of all, using TIF funds according to the way that the law prescribes we should use them in blighted neighborhoods. But secondly, we need to bring back vocational schools. We have to teach people to fish, not give them a fish. And then we have to give startups and small businesses economic stimulus through tax incentives to go to those neighborhoods to create an environment where people have a job now that we have a trained workforce. And then what we could do is assume some of those abandoned properties that we're selling for $1 a piece, rehab them, and create affordable housing all at the same time. So the three biggest problems that are vexing the city cannot be separated out. You can't separate the crime from the taxes from the education system that are all failing at the same time. They all have to be treated holistically. If we win one and lose two, we're not going to move forward. You have to win all three of those at the same time to make the city move forward.
He is Garry McCarthy. Garry, where can people get more information? A website, people get more information on your candidacy?
Garry for Mayor, which is naturally Garry with 2 R's, that I've been explaining my whole life. It's my maternal grandmother's maiden name.
Oh, there you go. All right.
GarryForMayor.com.
GarryForMayor.com. He's Garry McCarthy, former Chicago police chief, candidate for mayor, February 26th. Garry, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. Thank you.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
If you're talking about it, Dan and Amy are talking about it. It's Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
I'm Keith